I have listened to Your Honor's rambling long enough. Quite frankly, Your Honor is incompetent and corrupt.
Providence Municipal Court. A Wednesday morning that started like any other. Case files stacked on the clerk's desk, the usual crowd filtering in through the double doors. Parking tickets, minor violations, the ordinary machinery of local justice turning slowly forward. Nothing about the docket suggested this would be a session anyone would remember. Then Marcus Thornton walked in. He arrived in a Mercedes S-Class worth $150,000, stepping out with the unhurried ease of someone who has never been made to wait for anything. Tom Ford suit, Patek Philippe watch catching the light, Italian leather shoes tapping against courthouse pavement like a metronome, set to the tempo of his own importance. He moved through space as though the world was simply arranged around him. Other people, other schedules, other concerns, all secondary. The bailiff held the door. Marcus didn't acknowledge him. The clerk looked up from the desk. Marcus looked through her. He wasn't being rude in the obvious theatrical sense. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to shake. The absolute unthinking certainty that the people around him simply did not register. But there was something else. Walking 2 steps behind him was a boy, 12 years old, Tyler Mitchell. Dressed well, designer shoes, the kind of clothes most kids his age would admire. But his shoulders were curved inward and his eyes stayed down, and when Marcus spoke, the boy flinched, just slightly. Not dramatically, just the small, learned flinch of a child who has been conditioned to expect the edge of a word before it arrives. He took his seat in the front row without being told, folded his hands in his lap, and made himself as small as possible. That posture told a story of its own, even before a single word of testimony had been offered. I am Frederick, and I cover courtroom stories, the ones where what looks simple on the surface turns into something much harder to sit with. Hit that like button if you appreciate stories told straight, without fuss. That detail about the boy was the first thing that didn't add up, and by the end of this session, nothing about Marcus Thornton would add up at all. He approached Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom the same way he probably approached every room, like he already owned the outcome. He didn't acknowledge the bailiff, didn't acknowledge the clerk. His phone was in his hand, thumb scrolling, because evidently a traffic violation in Providence was the kind of appointment that didn't warrant his full attention. The gallery was moderately full that morning. Working people, a retired couple near the aisle, a young mother with documents spread across her lap, and in the very back row, 2 elderly people sitting completely still, watching Marcus Thornton with expressions that were difficult to read at first, something between grief and barely managed fury. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from the paperwork and asked Marcus, with characteristic patience, to put the phone away and give the court his attention. Marcus offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes and explained that he was managing a billion-dollar crisis. He said it casually, the way someone mentions the weather. The implication was clear. This room, these people, this proceeding, none of it quite measured up to his actual concerns. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, not because they were surprised exactly, but because hearing it said that plainly, in a courtroom, still had a kind of impact. There's a particular kind of dismissiveness that's worse than rudeness. Rudeness at least acknowledges you exist. What Marcus was doing was something colder, treating the entire proceeding as a bureaucratic inconvenience he was willing to fund his way out of. He wasn't angry, he wasn't defensive. He was simply bored. And that boredom was its own kind of insult to everyone in that room. The charge itself was clear. 45 in a 25 miles per hour school zone. 3rd speeding violation in 18 months. Marcus acknowledged he was speeding, offered to pay the fine, and asked if they could wrap things up quickly because he had a board meeting in an hour. Judge Caprio noted the pattern. First offence, 43 in a 30. Second, 52 in a 35, now this, in a zone where children cross the street. Marcus's response was to describe 3 violations over 18 months as statistically reasonable given his mileage. He also suggested, with complete sincerity, that school zone speed limits of 25 miles per hour were arbitrary, especially when school wasn't in session. He used the word arbitrary the way someone uses it when they believe their own judgment is the more reliable standard. The gallery reacted quietly. A woman in the third row leaned toward her companion and whispered something sharp. That's when Tyler spoke from the front row, quietly, almost to himself. He suggested they just pay the fine and leave. Marcus turned to the boy, flashed annoyance for just a moment before catching himself, then told Tyler that adults were talking. He said he brought Tyler to these things so the boy could learn how authority worked, that sometimes you had to show people you weren't intimidated by costumes and gavels. Judge Caprio removed his glasses slowly. He asked Marcus directly whether he had just referred to the court's judicial authority as a costume. Marcus, to his credit if nothing else, at least had the self-awareness to recognise he had made an error. He tried to reframe it as a lesson in confidence in navigating institutional power, but the word was already out there, hanging in the air of a room where a bailiff, a prosecutor, a gallery full of working people, and a judge with 38 years on the bench had all heard it clearly. The bailiff's hand moved slightly, an unconscious shift in posture. Judge Caprio's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes did. The judge responded that this was not a business negotiation, that the respect shown in a courtroom wasn't about ceremony, it was about acknowledging that laws apply to everyone equally, regardless of bank account or job title. Marcus forced a tight smile and said he understood completely, and could they please just settle the fine amount because he really needed to leave. The case continued, and that's when the registration came up. The Mercedes. $150,000 of German engineering wasn't registered in Marcus Thornton's name. It was registered to Tyler Mitchell Trust. Judge Caprio's attention sharpened. He asked about the nature of that relationship. Marcus explained that Tyler had come to live with him 8 months ago, that the car was technically part of the boy's estate, but that he had full authority to use trust assets as he saw fit for Tyler's benefit. Then the judge asked directly whether Marcus was Tyler's father. And Marcus, with absolute confidence, his chest actually expanding slightly as he said it, told the court 5 words. I'm his real father now. The room went quiet in a way that felt less like silence and more like pressure. A woman near the gallery covered her mouth. Someone muttered something low and sharp, and in the back row, the 2 elderly people who'd been sitting so still throughout went rigid. The man's fists closed. The woman shut her eyes, and tears moved down her face without a sound. Tyler, at the front of the room, went pale. His hands gripped the bench edge until his knuckles were white. He didn't cry out. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, absorbing it, the way children absorb things they've been trained not to react to. Judge Caprio asked Marcus to elaborate on what he meant by that. Marcus obliged. He explained that Tyler's biological father had offered, in his words, a substantially different life. No opportunities, no real future to speak of. He described everything he'd given the boy in 8 months. Private school at Lawrence Academy, 6 countries visited, access to connections that would set Tyler up for life. He said he had transformed the boy's existence. He said he had made Tyler into something. That sentence landed harder than most. Made him into something. As though the child sitting a few feet away was an asset that had required development, a project that needed turning around. I don't have any reason to believe Marcus Thornton understood how that sounded, and somehow that makes it worse. Because it means he wasn't performing cruelty, he genuinely believed what he was saying. He believed the provision of expensive things was the same as love, and that a dead man's place in a child's heart could simply be vacated and refilled. The prosecutor, who had been listening in growing silence, stood up and asked to speak. He opened a folder. Tyler's mother, Rebecca Mitchell, had married Marcus Thornton 11 months ago. 7 months ago, she passed away after a battle with terminal cancer. Tyler's biological father, David Mitchell, had been killed in action in Kandahar province 4 years earlier while serving with the United States Army. Sergeant David Mitchell had received the Bronze Star posthumously for valor in combat. The elderly couple in the back row were David Mitchell's parents, Tyler's grandparents. Robert Mitchell, 73, a Vietnam veteran himself, wearing his own uniform with the kind of posture that doesn't come from pride but from grief he had learnt to carry upright. Helen Mitchell, 70, holding a framed photograph of her son in his army dress uniform, her hands wrapped around the frame like she was protecting something irreplaceable. The man that Marcus Thornton had just casually written off, the man he had implied was less than adequate because he was dead and therefore couldn't provide Princeton connections, had died in Kandahar at 29 years old, carrying a photograph of his son, serving a country that housed the very courtroom they were standing in. Judge Caprio stood. When Judge Frank Caprio stands during a session, the room feels it. He asked Marcus, slowly and directly, whether he was telling the court that he had just erased a decorated war hero, a man who gave his life, a father who loved his son. Marcus tried to hold his ground. He said he respected David's service. Of course he did. But the reality, the painful reality, was that David was gone. Tyler needed a father who was present. He argued that bravery didn't pay for Princeton, that it didn't open doors in Manhattan, that he wasn't diminishing anyone's sacrifice, just being realistic about what Tyler needed now. Judge Caprio told him to stop. He said the word Marcus had reached for, realistic, wasn't the right one. He called what Marcus was doing something else entirely. The word he used was obscene. The Mitchells were allowed to come forward. What you hear in the comments section after stories like this one, people who were raised by absent step-parents, who were kept from grandparents, who were told to be grateful and to move forward and to stop living in the past. I think of those people when Robert Mitchell started speaking, because the thing that damages a child most in those situations isn't always the obvious cruelty. It's the systematic dismantling of who they were before, the quiet erasure conducted under the language of opportunity and gratitude and moving on. Robert described his son. David had been 29 when he died. He loved Tyler more than anything. Before his final deployment, he sat down with his father and made him make a promise that if something happened, they would make sure Tyler knew what kind of man his father was. Brave, selfless, honourable. A man who believed in protecting others, even at the cost of his own life. Since Rebecca died, the Mitchells had tried to maintain contact. Calls went unanswered. Letters came back. They showed up at the house and were turned away. Marcus had changed Tyler's school without notifying them, moved to a gated community and effectively cut off every line of access. 4 months had passed since they had been allowed to see their grandson. 4 months during which Tyler had been living in that house, with those photographs gone from the walls, with his father's name treated as a subject to be avoided. Marcus interrupted to call this irrelevant to a traffic violation. Judge Caprio told him to sit down and be quiet. He said every word out of Marcus's mouth was making things worse. Helen Mitchell spoke next, quietly, steadily. She described what Tyler had told them in the one phone call they had managed to get through, that Marcus had removed every photograph of David from the house. Every single one. Not stored in a box, not moved to Tyler's room, removed entirely, as though the man had never existed. Drop a comment below. Have you ever seen someone try to erase a good person just to make themselves look necessary? Then Tyler stood up. He said he missed his dad, his real dad. He said Marcus wouldn't let him talk about his father, told him that being sad was holding him back from his potential. He said that if he wanted to keep living in a nice house and going to the good school, he had to stop talking about someone who was dead. He said Marcus had offered him a trip to Europe for Christmas if Tyler called him dad at school and stopped mentioning his father. You had to choose between the past and the future. That was the arrangement as Tyler understood it. The gallery didn't stay quiet after that. Voices broke through, not shouting exactly, but the kind of audible reactions that people can't fully hold back when they hear something genuinely wrong said plainly by a child in a courtroom. The bailiff called for order. Judge Caprio raised one hand and the room settled. He spoke to Tyler directly, gently. His tone completely transformed from the one he had used with Marcus. He asked the boy to explain what he had meant about being told to choose between his father's memory and having a home. Tyler described it in the straightforward way children describe painful things. Without performance, without embellishment, just the facts as he had understood them. His mother and father had left him money. Marcus was in charge of it until Tyler turned 18. Marcus had shown him papers once, called it investing for his future. Tyler had accepted that. He hadn't known what else to do. Judge Caprio turned to the financial report submitted by the Mitchell's attorney. Tyler Mitchell's trust, built from his mother's life insurance, her estate, and his father's military death benefits, had totaled $782,000 8 months earlier. In 7 months, 47 withdrawals. The judge read from the document, $28,000 to a private aviation company, $35,000 to a country club for membership fees, $42,000 for a down payment on a Range Rover registered in Marcus Thornton's name, $67,000 transferred to Thornton Capital Management, Marcus's own company, labelled as investment management fees. The gallery reacted with audible disgust. Not one of those expenses had anything to do with Tyler's education, Tyler's welfare, or Tyler's future. Each one was Marcus Thornton using a dead soldier's insurance payout to maintain a lifestyle he had not been able to sustain on his own. Over $300,000, according to the forensic accountant the Mitchells had hired, was simply gone, transferred to Marcus's struggling company, used to cover personal debts, used to fund the country club and the private flights and the Range Rover that Marcus drove while calling himself a devoted father. The prosecutor added the final piece, and it was the one that explained everything that had come before it. Marcus Thornton had been in serious financial trouble before meeting Rebecca Mitchell. His company was facing potential bankruptcy, personal debts exceeding $400,000. He had married Rebecca exactly 6 weeks after her stage 4 cancer diagnosis. Within days of the marriage, he had begun repositioning her assets. Text messages recovered from his phone included conversations with his business partner in which he referred to Rebecca's illness as an exit strategy and Tyler's trust as a bridge loan to save the company. He had known she was dying. He had known there was money. He had married her anyway, with full awareness of both facts, and then spent the following months methodically converting a 12-year-old boy's inheritance into a corporate rescue fund. I've covered enough of these cases to understand that not all harm comes from people who seem obviously dangerous. Sometimes it comes quietly, from someone in a tailored suit who uses words like provision, an opportunity, and realistic, right up until the moment you look carefully at what they actually did and why they did it. The suit doesn't change the math. Judge Caprio stood for the second time. He spoke for several minutes, and what he said carried the weight of nearly 4 decades on that bench. He described greed, negligence, cruelty born from desperation. He said what he was looking at now was something different from all of those things. It was calculated, predatory, disguised carefully as guardianship. He said Marcus had walked into the courtroom and erased a war hero, had commodified a grieving child, had turned love into a transaction. Then he delivered his rulings. The traffic fine was raised to the maximum of $1,000. Marcus's license was suspended for 12 months. He was held in contempt, $500 fine, 30 days in the Providence County Jail. An emergency custody hearing was ordered immediately, with Tyler placed in the care of Robert and Helen Mitchell, effective at the conclusion of the session, with no contact permitted unless explicitly authorized by a family court judge. The case was referred to the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office for investigation of financial fraud, embezzlement, and exploitation of a minor. All assets purchased with funds from Tyler's trust were frozen pending a full forensic audit. The Mercedes was to be impounded. Any other property or holdings acquired using trust funds would be seized and liquidated to restore what had been taken. Marcus stood up, his voice unsteady now, and said the judge couldn't do this. He said he had rights. He said he was Tyler's legal guardian. Judge Caprio corrected him. He had been Tyler's guardian. Past tense. The rights he was invoking had been forfeited the moment he chose to exploit a child who had already lost everything. He said Marcus had seen an orphan and seen opportunity, had seen a widow dying of cancer and seen a solution to a cash flow problem. That was not guardianship, that was predation. The gallery applauded. Real applause, the sustained kind that happens when a room full of people feels something fundamentally correct has just occurred. Veterans were on their feet. The bailiff made no move to quiet it. The handcuffs clicked. The sound carried in a room that had gone still enough to hear it. As he was walked toward the door, Marcus turned back. He looked at Tyler and said the boy should tell everyone how well Marcus had taken care of him. He said Tyler had had a good life with him. Tyler looked up from his grandfather's arms and said quietly that he'd had a good life before Marcus arrived. He'd had his mother. He'd had his memories of his father. Marcus hadn't given him a life. He had bought his silence. The door closed. Outside in the late morning sun, Tyler stood on the courthouse steps between his grandparents. Helen pulled out her phone and showed him photographs. David as a child, David in high school, David in his uniform, David in the hospital holding newborn Tyler, his face full of the particular wonder of a man who cannot quite believe his luck. Tyler's fingers moved across the screen slowly, tracing his father's face. He said he remembered him. He did remember. Robert told him quietly that they would make sure it stayed that way. Every story, every photograph, every memory David had shared with them before he deployed, all of it would be passed on. None of it was going to be lost. If you want to keep hearing stories about people who refuse to let the truth get buried, subscribe to Frederick Explains Court. That's exactly what this channel is here for. A traffic citation brought Marcus Thornton into that courtroom. He arrived believing the fine was the only thing at stake, that wealth was sufficient armor against any consequence a municipal courtroom could produce. He left in handcuffs, his guardianship revoked, his finances frozen, his text messages entered into a public record that would follow him into whatever criminal proceedings came next. He had walked in believing that money provided cover for everything. Judge Caprio, patient and methodical and entirely unimpressed by the watch or the suit or the board meeting waiting across town, simply waited for the moment when the facts made that belief impossible to maintain. Tyler walked out with his grandparents. He walked out with a photograph of his father, and for the first time in 8 months, he smiled. Not the practiced social smile Marcus had coached him toward, but the kind that arrives on its own when something you thought was gone turns out to still be there, waiting, held safe by people who never stopped.